The sea has always been a thief of men. It swallows ships, drowns sailors, and erases names from memory with a single turn of the tide. But every so often, it leaves behind a fragment, something broken, something incomplete. In the winter of 1910, on a remote lighthouse battered by wind and waves, one such fragment surfaced. A keeper who seemed to vanish not only from his post, but from history itself. His life, his sanity, and perhaps even his body were claimed by forces we still cannot fully name. What remains is a trail of silence, half-written logbooks, and whispers of a presence that watched him from the shadows of his lonely tower. Imagine the scene, a storm-swept outpost at the edge of the known world, its beam slicing through the fog like a warning to the living and a summons to the dead. A solitary figure paces the lantern room, recording the mundane details of weather and tides. Then, as if the sea itself demanded payment, he disappears, leaving behind only questions. What happened inside those walls? Did madness take him, or did something far older and darker reach through the mist to claim him? Few have heard this story, and even fewer have dared to confront what it might mean. Yet to explore it is to step into a liminal place where fact and nightmare converge. This is not merely the tale of a man lost to time. It is a reflection on the fragility of the human mind when cut adrift from the world. So I ask you, do you believe isolation alone can drive a person to madness? Or do you suspect that in the forgotten corners of history, something else still waits to be uncovered? The early 20th century was an age of steel and steam, yet the sea remained untamed. Ships still vanished into the deep without warning, swallowed by storms or dashed against hidden reefs. Navigation had advanced, but mariners continued to rely on one ancient promise, the lighthouse, a solitary sentinel standing between life and death. Its revolving beam offered reassurance to those at sea, a sign of safe passage, of human presence in a world of indifferent waves. But for those stationed within its walls, that same light meant something else entirely: confinement, silence, and the slow erosion of self. Lighthouse keepers in 1910 lived in conditions few today can imagine. Their work was vital, their lives invisible. They were both guardians and prisoners, tasked with keeping the light burning no matter the cost. Supplies came sporadically, ferried by small boats that braved the waters when the weather allowed. Weeks could pass without sight of another soul. Letters from home, if they arrived at all, were read and reread until the ink faded, the words etched deeper into memory than into paper. In this way, men became shadows, isolated figures bound to the rhythm of the sea. The lighthouse in question was one of the loneliest. Perched on a rocky promontory that jutted out like a skeletal finger, it was battered ceaselessly by the Atlantic. Winter storms could cut it off for months, turning it into an island of stone and iron, a cell with no key. Approaching by boat was treacherous. Jagged rocks sliced through hulls like knives, and waves could overturn a skiff in seconds. To those on land, it was an outpost of salvation. To those inside, it was a crucible. The architecture itself lent to the feeling of entrapment. Thick stone walls rose against the gales, their windows narrow, more like slits in a fortress than openings to the world. The spiral stairway wound endlessly upward, its echoes magnified in the emptiness. Every sound was amplified: the creak of wood, the groan of iron, the heartbeat-like thud of waves below. By day, keepers climbed the tower to tend the light, polished glass until it gleamed, wound mechanisms with meticulous care. By night, they patrolled in darkness, their lanterns casting brief arcs of gold against walls that seemed to lean closer with every step. This was not a place where one lived so much as endured. The keepers became custodians of isolation itself, their lives marked by repetition and silence. They measured time not by days, but by oil burned, by foghorns sounded, by storms survived. When they dreamed, the sea invaded those dreams, filling their sleep with drowning voices or waves crashing against invisible shores. And when they woke, they returned to a chamber of solitude, where even their own thoughts could become untrustworthy companions. To visiting sailors, the lighthouse was a miracle. Its light meant survival, its sound a lifeline in the fog. But to the man stationed there, the very same glow was both a tether and a curse. It symbolized duty, yes, but also confinement, his beacon, a reminder that while others moved freely across the waters, he remained anchored to stone, a servant of the flame, safety beacon to the outside world, prison of solitude within. It is in this stark contrast that the haunting of 1910 takes root. For the keeper, his post was not merely about maintaining machinery, it was about resisting the erosion of his mind. Every crash of the sea, every whisper of wind through the tower became another test of endurance. And while his body remained, confined within stone walls, his imagination was free to wander, perhaps too free, roaming into places where reality and nightmare blurred. But beyond the rhythmic flashing of light, something else stirred. His name, like the lighthouse itself, has nearly been erased by time, but scraps of record allow us to reconstruct the man who once stood guard against the sea. He was not a sailor of great renown, nor a figure history would ordinarily preserve. He was, instead, a working man of quiet resolve, chosen less for heroism than for endurance. The authorities sought men who could withstand monotony, who would not falter when cut off from society. Yet even the most steadfast heart can be corroded by silence. The keeper was in his early 30s, weathered by a life of labor. Before the post, he had been a fisherman, a son of the coast who knew the ocean's moods. It was said he had lost a brother to the sea, a tragedy that left him both wary of the water and bound to it. When offered the position of lighthouse keeper, he accepted, perhaps seeing it as a way to serve without venturing into the dangers of open waters. Yet what he exchanged for safety was no less perilous: the gradual erosion of the self. From scattered accounts and fragments of logs, a portrait emerges. His writing was neat, methodical, at times almost compulsively ordered. He recorded wind direction, barometric pressure, wave height, and the performance of the lamp with a near-clinical precision. Between these dry details, however, came glimpses of the man himself, brief mentions of dreams that woke him, of songs he hummed from memory, of the ache in his hands when storms battered the coast for days. In one note he scribbled, "Silence deepens. It presses, as though the stone itself wishes to speak." It was an unsettling choice of words, the kind that betrays an encroaching awareness of something beyond the ordinary. On shore, he had left behind a wife and a young child. The letters he received from them, when the weather allowed delivery, were cherished artifacts. One was found, folded and refolded until the creases nearly tore the paper. His wife described their daughter learning to speak new words, her laughter filling the small cottage where they lived. For the keeper, such details were a tether to humanity, proof that beyond the roaring sea lay warmth, voices, and light. But each letter also sharpened his sense of separation. Every mention of a missed birthday or a neighbor's gathering reminded him of the life slipping away while he remained locked in stone. Imagine, for a moment, leaving everything you love behind: your family, your friends, the familiar sounds of daily life, and trading it for months of wind, salt, and silence. Would you last? Or would the absence begin to carve into you, hollowing your mind until the smallest noise became a phantom companion? The keeper carried with him his duty, yes, but he also carried the unbearable weight of solitude. Those who knew him described him as steady but inward, a man given to long silences, even in company. Such temperament was considered ideal for a keeper, a mind less likely to rebel against monotony. Yet solitude can magnify every small flaw. A tendency toward quiet introspection may harden into paranoia. A strong sense of duty may curdle into obsession. The very traits that won him the post may have sown the seeds of his undoing. The log entries reveal a man caught between two identities: the duty-bound servant of the sea and the fragile human battling unseen pressures. In one entry, he wrote, "Light steady, seas violent. I feel watched." That last note, casual, almost tossed into the margin, suggests more than simple nerves. It hints at the birth of a fracture, the intrusion of something he could neither name nor dismiss. And so, we see the keeper not merely as a figure in uniform, but as a man balancing two worlds. On the one hand, he was a custodian of safety, his lamp a shield against the perils of navigation. On the other, he was a mortal, soul vulnerable to loneliness, to memory, to the gnawing sense that his stone tower was more prison than sanctuary. He was at once anchor and castaway, servant of duty and victim of silence. As we move deeper into his story, those dualities will sharpen. For now, it is enough to understand this. The man who vanished was no nameless watchman. He was flesh, blood, and longing, a man whose cracks widened not under cannon fire or shipwreck, but under the weight of time, solitude, and the things that stir when silence grows too deep. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar grind of duty, the daily rhythm of trimming wicks, polishing glass, and recording weather patterns. Yet as winter pressed its weight upon the coast, something in the keeper's notes began to shift. His entries, once crisp and orderly, became uneven. The measured script that once mirrored his steady temperament grew jagged, as though written by a hand trembling with fatigue. The words themselves grew thinner, punctuated by odd asides that broke the flow of routine. On December 3rd, he wrote, "Fog heavy, visibility 1 mile. Heard something on the rocks like voices carried by the tide." To the untrained eye, this was nothing more than a sailor's imagination, the sea's constant noise playing tricks. But the next day, the entry continued. Fog persists. Lantern burned clear. Voices again. Closer. These small shifts, easily overlooked, marked the first fracture lines in his account. The noises came most often during the still hours before dawn. A scraping at the base of the tower. The low moan of wind that seemed to form syllables. At first, he described them clinically, as one might a minor inconvenience. But as the days passed, his notes grew more uncertain, as though he struggled to convince himself of their banality. Woke to knocking. Checked doors locked. No one there. Could not sleep after. The fog itself became a presence in his writing, not merely weather, but a living force pressing in on the glass. "It does not move with the wind," he scribbled. In one margin, "It holds. It waits." Sailors had long spoken of fog as a thief, swallowing ships whole, but for the keeper it became something more insidious, a silent intruder, pressing against the windows like breath on glass. By mid-December, the handwriting had changed. Lines slanted, words ran together, and the measured tone of duty gave way to jagged bursts of thought. Where once he recorded lantern trimmed, oil half full, he now added strange reflections. "I hear the sea climbing the stairs at night." One page bore deep indentations where the pen had torn through. A furious scrawl repeated 3 times. "Do not open the door?" What door? The lighthouse had but one, bolted and secure. Yet his emphasis on it grew obsessive. Again and again, he circled back to the door at the base of the tower, the threshold between stone and storm. "It rattles though no wind is there. It waits for me to open." His language no longer read like observation. but like a man bargaining with something unseen. Other keepers in other stations had written of similar experiences. There are scattered records of men hearing cries. In the fog, of footsteps pacing just outside their quarters. Science offers explanations. Fatigue, sensory deprivation, the brain conjuring patterns where none exist. But to read the keeper's words is to sense something deeper, a mind not simply straining under pressure, but reacting to an intrusion. One log, dated December 17th, reads, "Saw a figure on the rocks, motionless. Watched until the fog closed it away. Not a sailor, not a man." The entry stops there, the ink trailing as though he could not bring himself to finish. Was it a trick of mist and shadow? Or did he see something that refused to conform to human shape? You might be tempted to dismiss these notes as exhaustion. Weeks of isolation, the endless gray horizon, and the monotony of labor can unmoor even the most disciplined mind. But ask yourself, at what point does fatigue become something more? If you found yourself writing these words hearing knocks at a locked door, seeing figures on the rocks, would you chalk it up to tiredness? Or would a darker suspicion creep in? The disturbances grew bolder as the year waned. One night he wrote, "The light faltered. Glass intact, oil full. I swear the flame bent as though blown from within." Another time, dreamed of water rising up the stairwell. Woke to wet prints on the landing. He did not specify whose prints they were. By late December, his entries began to fray into half-thoughts, as though language itself could no longer contain his experience. Single words appeared on otherwise blank pages, listening, closer, behind. The methodical keeper, who once charted the sea with precision, now seemed consumed by something that resisted recording, something that gnawed at the edges of sense. And then came the night when the logbook simply stopped. The silence was no longer silence. It had texture, a density that pressed against the walls of the tower and seeped into the keeper's bones. What had once been the familiar hush of sea and stone transformed into something suffocating, as though the very air carried a pulse. At first, he tried to treat it as an illusion. He wrote of wind speeds, oil consumption, tides clinging to routine, like a drowning man clutching driftwood. But his entries reveal a man slipping, page by page, into a world where the boundary between sound and thought collapsed. The phantom knocks came most often at night. At irregular intervals, the base of the lighthouse shuddered as if a heavy hand rapped against the door. He descended with his lantern, each time finding nothing, no footprints in the sand, no evidence of trespass. Yet the knocks continued. Sometimes they shifted to the spiral stairwell, echoing upward until he swore someone was following just behind him. His notes grew frantic, scrawled in lines that seemed to race the very thing he feared. Steps behind me. Turn no one there. Steps continue when I climb. Sleep became a stranger. When he closed his eyes, he saw water rising through the cracks in the stone, flooding the chamber, dragging him under. He woke to the same emptiness, but the sensation of drowning clung to him like salt. Fatigue blurred the edges of his vision. He recorded shadows moving against the lantern glass, though no one passed. He claimed the beam itself bent, illuminating. Not sea, but figures in the mist-long silhouettes standing motionless, as though waiting for him to acknowledge them. Rational explanations exist. Sleep deprivation can produce hallucinations, auditory and visual. Cabin fever, as psychologists later called it, corrodes the mind with monotony, breeding paranoia and voices from within. The lighthouse, after all, was a pressure cooker of loneliness. Days without human contact, nights filled only with the sea's roar. And yet, the consistency of his visions, recorded with a meticulous hand even as his sanity faltered, suggests he was not merely inventing phantoms. He was responding to something. Maritime lore offers other explanations. Sailors spoke of drowned men who wandered the shores in fog, seeking companions to drag into the deep. They told of the phantom knockers, spirits of shipwrecked sailors who tapped on hulls or doors, luring men outside to join them in the surf. Others whispered of cursed waters, where lighthouses themselves became infected, their stones absorbing. Centuries of grief until the walls wept salt. The keeper's notes echo these tales, almost as if he had read them, though no record suggests he had. "They want me to open," he wrote. Not wind, not storm, something else. His descent unfolded not as a sudden break, but as a slow erosion. Each day, another piece of his rational mind crumbled away. He stopped eating regularly, writing instead of meals left untouched, because the smell was wrong. He left lamps burning at all hours, as though terrified of darkness. He wrote of hearing his daughter's voice echoing through the stairwell, calling his name with laughter. When he searched, of course, he found only stone. One entry, among the last legible, reads, "Sang with her tonight. She sat beside me. I know she is safe, though she is not here. The sea delivered her." The handwriting was jagged, yet the words carried the conviction of truth. To him, the hallucination was not fantasy, but visitation. The sea had become both messenger and thief, delivering voices from the world he had left behind. The deeper we read into his journals, the more reality itself seems to fracture. On one page, he describes repairing the lantern's mechanism with perfect technical clarity. On the next, he writes, "The fog moves against the wind. It knocks when I sleep. I am not keeper now. I am kept." It is a chilling inversion of his role. No longer guardian of the light, he believed himself imprisoned by a force using the lighthouse as its cage. Outside observers' relief crews, historians, investigators later argued he succumbed to isolation, that the noises were the settling of stone, the footsteps his own echo, the voices products of exhaustion. These explanations satisfy the rational mind, offering a box to contain the horror. But his words resist containment. They are too vivid, too insistent, too steeped in the cadence of experience. He was not merely describing symptoms. He was recording encounters. And so the question lingers. Did the keeper descend into madness of his own making, or did he glimpse something ancient that thrived in silence? Was he a fragile man unraveling, or a witness whose testimony was dismissed because it frightened those tasked with preserving order? As the final days of his record approach, his entries no longer read like logs at all. They resembled confessions, or warnings left for whoever might come after. Do not answer the knocks. Do not follow the voice. The light must burn, but the dark will always wait. The journals end not with conclusion, but with rupture, a trail of ink that leads into silence. And it is within that silence, perhaps, that the truth waits, whether born of madness or of something the sea has kept, secret since long before men built their towers of stone and light. When the relief crew finally arrived, the sea was calmer than it had been for weeks. The men rowed across the surf with the practiced caution of sailors who knew how suddenly the Atlantic could betray them. Their orders were simple: resupply, rotate the keeper, and return him to shore for a brief reprieve. They expected the same ritual of weary greetings, hurried exchanges of news, and the relief that came with stepping onto solid ground after weeks confined to stone. But as they drew near, something felt wrong. The lighthouse stood dark. Its lantern, which should have pulsed rhythmically across their horizon, was lifeless. The tower loomed like a hollow tooth, black against the gray sky. No signal fire. Number. Movement. Only the unbroken line of the sea pressing against rock. The crew shouted as they approached, calling the keeper's name into the wind. No reply. They secured the boat with difficulty, clambered up the slippery landing, and forced, opened the heavy wooden door. What greeted them inside has since been told and retold, each version shaded by the teller's intent, yet certain details recur, persistent as the tide. The interior showed no sign of struggle. The keeper's personal effects were present. Clothing neatly folded, boots by the door, a pipe resting on the windowsill as though recently set down. In the galley, a meal lay untouched, congealed by time as though interrupted mid-bite. A chair had been overturned, though whether by haste or accident, no one could say. The lantern oil supply was full, the mechanisms intact, yet the light had been extinguished. Most disturbing of all was the logbook. At first, its pages carried the expected entries: weather, maintenance, ship sightings. Then came the erratic notes, the fragmented thoughts, the jagged handwriting. The final entry was barely legible, the ink smeared as though the pen had been dragged mid-word. It waits behind, and there the page ended. Some say the paper was torn, others that the ink bled where his hand trembled. Whatever the truth, no continuation was ever found. Imagine holding that final page in your hands. The ink still dark, the words trailing into nothing. If you found. His last entry half written, smudged, what would you make of it? Would you dismiss it as the scrawl of a man undone by solitude? Or would you feel, as some of the relief crew later admitted, the chill of standing where he had stood, sensing eyes in the silence that followed his disappearance? Contemporary reports attempted to impose order on the mystery. The official explanation leaned toward accident, that he slipped while tending the rocks, swept away by a wave too sudden to resist. Others suggested suicide, the crushing loneliness finally breaking his will. A third theory posited desertion, that he abandoned his post, attempting to row to shore, and drowned in the attempt. These theories satisfied the bureaucrats who filed their paperwork and closed the case. They could be explained, catalogued, forgotten. But among the sailors, the whispers spread differently. Men who had stepped inside the tower spoke of an atmosphere heavy and unnatural, a silence that seemed to listen. One swore he heard knocks on the stairwell as they searched, though no one else had climbed above him. Another reported finding: salt water pooled on the landing, though the windows were sealed tight. These accounts never made it into the official reports, but they circulated in taverns and harbors, carried along by those who knew that not all truths find their way onto paper. Local folklore soon merged with the tale. Old fishermen claimed the waters near the lighthouse were cursed, haunted by those lost to shipwrecks centuries before. They spoke of the Muir Mara, sea spirits said to lure men from shore with voices of loved ones. Others recalled legends of the watchers in the fog, figures that appeared on rocks and vanished when approached. To them, the keeper had not simply died, he had been taken. Even within the crew, divisions emerged. Some clung to rational explanations, unwilling to credit superstition. They pointed to the overturned chair, the half-eaten meal, the possibility of a sudden call to duty. That led him outside. Others avoided speaking of it altogether, refusing to tempt whatever force had left the tower empty. Silence, after all, is safer than speculation when one suspects the sea itself may be listening. Archival fragments add little certainty. Inquiries conducted by the Maritime Board cite probable drowning. The keeper's widow received a modest pension and little else. No body was ever recovered. The tower was restaffed within weeks, as though the man who vanished had been no more than a faulty cog in a machine too vital to halt. And yet the replacement keepers reported unease. One left after only a fortnight, writing to his superiors that he could not sleep for the sound of voices. The investigation, then, becomes less a matter of evidence and more one of interpretation. What do we make of the logbook's final words? Was it waits behind, the frantic imagination of a man unraveling? Or was it the beginning of a Message he never had the chance to finish? Behind what? Behind the door? Behind the fog? Behind him? In the stairwell? The possibilities fester like open wounds, each more unsettling than the last. In time, the incident blurred into half-memory, absorbed by the countless tragedies of the sea. Yet its details remain unnerving because they resist closure. A meal abandoned, a chair overturned, a final sentence cut short. Human beings crave resolution, but here there is none. We are left with a vacuum where truth should be, a silence deeper than the waves. It is tempting, in such absence, to choose the safety of rationality, to say he slipped, he drowned, and the sea kept his body. But the folk stories, the whispers of phantom knocks, the salt water where none should be, these linger like fog, refusing to disperse, and in that refusal lies the terror. Because if the sea did not merely claim his life, but his very presence from the world, then what else does it hold in its depths, waiting for the next keeper to stand watch? The relief. Crew, after completing their grim inspection, left the tower as they found it. Boots by the door, pipe on the sill, logbook with its final page unfinished. They lit the lantern, restored its beam, and rowed back across the water. But they carried with them a story that would not stay contained, a story that spread across harbors and coastal towns until it became legend. And yet, for all their theories and fears, no one could escape the chilling truth of what they found. For while the tower was empty, the lighthouse did not feel abandoned. It felt occupied. There are stories that resolve themselves neatly their edges, smoothed by explanation, their shadows illuminated by reason. The story of the vanished lighthouse keeper is not one of them. It resists order, it resists closure, and at its blackened heart lies a detail so grotesque, so chilling, that those who first encountered it chose silence over record official files, mention nothing. Maritime reports skirt the fact, but the whispers handed down in fragments converge upon a single horrific possibility. And yet the most disturbing piece of evidence was never officially recorded. Weeks after the keeper disappeared, a fisherman working the rocky coves not far from the lighthouse made a discovery. At first he believed he had hauled in driftwood battered by waves and tangled in kelp, but when he brought it closer, the truth sickened him. What he held was a human hand, pale and swollen, torn from the wrist. No arm, no body, just a hand. The sea, as it so often does, had returned something incomplete. Stories spread quickly among the locals. Some claimed the hand still gripped the remnants of fabric as though torn from its owner in violent struggle. Others swore the fingernails were worn down, as though the hand had clawed desperately against stone. None could say with certainty it belonged to the missing keeper, but who else could it have been? No shipwrecks had been reported nearby, no drownings recorded. The only man unaccounted for in those waters was the one who had vanished from the lighthouse. If true, this discovery paints a picture darker than accident or suicide. Body dashed against rocks would scatter, yes, but the presence of only a hand alone, with no trace of the rest, suggests something more deliberate, more obscene. To the rational mind it hints at violence, dismemberment, and end, not met by nature, but by something that tore flesh from bone. To the superstitious, it confirmed what the logbook had already whispered: he was claimed by a force that wanted him piecemeal consumed. Not whole, but in fragments, like an offering to the sea. Theories multiplied. Some said he had been dragged from the tower by drowned sailors. Spirits jealous of the living. They had taken him down into the deep, but the sea, indifferent, spat back a single part of him as proof. Others believed the hand was his own, severed in desperation, when something human or otherwise caught him in its grip. One tale even suggested he cut it off himself, driven mad by the sensation of another hand always holding his in the dark. The fisherman who found it swore to secrecy, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pity for the keeper's widow. But rumors spread faster than tidewater, and soon every tavern along the coast murmured of the keeper's hand, a relic of a Man erased from history. To speak of it aloud was considered bad luck, an invitation for the sea to take another. And so the detail never entered official records. But it lingered in the oral history of the community, a secret both grotesque and sacred. The revelation forces us to revisit the logbook with fresh eyes. Remember the repeated warnings. Do not open the door. It waits behind. The obsessive references to knocking, to footsteps, climbing the stairs. What if the hand was not merely a body, part adrift, but the remnant of a struggle within those very walls? What if the knocking was not phantom, but physical? And what stood on the other side of that bolted door was not wind or wave, but something that required entry, his refusal to open. May have saved him for a time, but perhaps in the end it made his fate all the more violent. Rationalists will argue otherwise. They will insist the hand, if it existed, was evidence of a simple drowning, that scavengers or rocks stripped flesh from zinc, the body casting the fragment ashore, and yet the combination of details is too pointed to ignore. A logbook that ends mid-sentence, a tower filled with silence, a meal left unfinished, and thin hand a relic of human absence, as if history itself had been gnawed away, leaving only a token behind. For those inclined toward folklore, the hand became a symbol. Sailors called it the price of the light. They said the sea demanded a piece of every keeper, that to serve in such solitude was to bargain with forces older than man. Some whispered that the lighthouse itself was built upon cursed stone, that every knock on the door was a debt collector come to claim what was owed, and if the keeper resisted, the sea took what it could grasp. The horror lies not only in the grotesque detail, but in what it implies that no one is safe from being partially erased. Man can vanish, yet fragments of him remain, mocking the living with their incompleteness. To imagine the hand is to imagine the rest. Struggle the terror, the moment when solitude gave way to something unspeakable, and still the logbook haunts us. That final entry, it waits behind. Did he mean behind the door? Behind him on the stairs? Behind reality itself, something pressing through. The cracks. If the hand was real, perhaps it was all that remained of the man who turned to face whatever waited behind him. We arrive then at a crossroad of explanation, accident, suicide, desertion, titty categories that fold the keeper back into the realm of human frailty, or the alternative possession sea spirits, cursed waters interpretations, that open the door to something vast, ancient, and unyielding. Neither answer satisfies, both leave us unsettled, and perhaps that is the truest horror of all. All that the sea keeps its secrets, and we are left only with fragments, forced to imagine the rest. The lighthouse still stands, its light still sweeps across the fog, and those who climb its stairs speak of a feeling subtle but unmistakable that someone ascends just behind them. Whether it is memory, imagination, or the echo of a man who left his hand behind, none can say. But the fact remains, the keeper vanished. His body was never found, and all history offers us is silence, rumor, and the grotesque suggestion of a single severed hand, a fragment that refuses to let the rest of him disappear. The sea is merciless, but it is also patient. Ships continue to sail, storms continue to break, and lighthouses continue to burn their signals into the night. And so it was with the lighthouse of 1910. Within weeks of the keeper's disappearance, the machinery of duty resumed. New men were dispatched to man the light. New supplies arrived by boat. The beam once more swept across the dark waters, as though nothing had ever happened. But the silence lingered. The authorities wasted little time shaping their explanation. To them, it was an unfortunate but unremarkable tragedy. The official record described it with chilling detachment. A likely accident. Perhaps he had fallen while attempting to repair something outside. Perhaps he was swept into the waves during a storm, his body lost to the sea. Case closed. With a stroke of the pen, his disappearance was transformed from mystery to bureaucratic inconvenience. For the families left behind, this explanation was no comfort. The keeper's wife, herself accustomed to long separations, received word. By letter, the phrasing was sparse, bloodless. Your husband is presumed drowned. No details of his final days. No acknowledgment of the logbook's descent into madness. No mention of rumors of a severed hand. She was expected to grieve quietly, remarry perhaps, and fold herself back into the fabric of a world that had neatly erased her husband. But the locals knew better. Along the coast, in taverns and kitchens, they whispered a different version. Of events, they spoke of the strange marks on the log, the ink smudged mid-sentence. They repeated the fisherman's tale of the hand pulled from the surf. And they warned newcomers never to volunteer for duty at that lighthouse unless they were prepared to be tested by the sea. The contrast was stark. To the authorities, the lighthouse was a symbol of progress, an essential cog in the machinery of empire. To the community, it was a haunted place, an edifice that had demanded and taken a life. This tension created a strange dual existence. The lighthouse remained proudly operational, yet among those who lived closest to its shadow, it was regarded as a cursed tower, a place where men vanished into silence. Those who served there after the keeper's disappearance reported unease. They never put it in writing, perhaps fearing ridicule, perhaps following orders, but word spread nonetheless. Some swore they heard footsteps pacing the lantern room at night when no one was there. Others claimed that meals, once left on the table, would seem subtly disturbed, as if someone unseen had sat down to eat. One keeper, years later, confided to a friend that every night he locked the door at the base of the tower, and yet each morning he would find it ajar. It was as if the vanished man had never truly left. His absence became a presence, heavy and watchful. For his family, the emotional toll was profound. The lack of a body meant no funeral, no grave to mark. His children, if he had them, were forced to grow up with a ghost for a father one, whose story was either sanitized by officials or distorted by folklore. His wife was left with whispers, haunted not only by grief, but by the suspicion that she was not being told the truth. To live with such ambiguity is its own form of torment, a wound that does not close because it cannot be named. Even decades later, the story persisted in fragments. Old men who had served at sea would lower their voices when speaking of that year. Fishermen warned their sons not to linger near the rocks below the lighthouse. And children, daring one another, in the twilight, told tales of a pale hand that still reached from the surf, clawing at stone. The silence of officialdom and the unease of the community created a vacuum into which myth seeped like fog. Rational voices insisted there was nothing to fear, that the sea had claimed a man as it always had. But those who lived nearest the water were not so certain. They sensed, perhaps better than anyone, that the truth had been buried, not lost, but deliberately hidden. And that is the question I leave with you. Was the truth buried simply to protect reputations, to shield the lighthouse service from scandal? Or was it hidden because to confront it would mean admitting something far darker, that within the boundaries of our rational world, there are forces that do not bend to reason? The lighthouse beam continued its sweep. Ships passed safely, guided by its light. But for those who knew the story, that rhythmic flash was no longer only a promise of safety. It was also a reminder. The sea remembers, even if men choose to forget. There is a reason stories like this linger long after the last official report has been filed away in some government archive. They touch a nerve that runs deeper than the disappearance of a single man. What happened in that lighthouse in 1910 forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, about the fragility of our minds, and about the shadows that creep in when silence becomes absolute. Isolation is both a test and a torment. Deprived of human contact, the mind begins to distort reality. Sounds grow sharper, shadows seem to move, The wind through the cracks takes on the cadence of a whisper. But here lies the unsettling question. Are these merely hallucinations, symptoms of a brain deprived of stimulation? Or do they strip away the layers of distraction we call civilization, allowing us to glimpse something that waits patiently beneath? We like to think of ourselves as rational beings, capable of explaining away mysteries with the tools of science and psychology. Cabin fever, we say. Sleep deprivation, depression. These are comforting explanations, tidy boxes into which we place things that scare us. But the keeper's story resists neat categorization. His log entries suggest a descent too precise, too deliberate, as though something were orchestrating his unraveling. And then, of course, there is the silence, the sudden stop of the pen, the unfinished thought that seems to hover forever between reason and terror. What does it mean to be alone with the sea? To hear its endless voice in the dark and to realize that, for months at a time, no other human will answer yours? Do we, in such moments, begin to hear our own madness or someone else's? Perhaps that is why these stories endure, because they reveal not only the dangers of the sea, but the fragility of the mind. They remind us that civilization is a thin veneer, that the lighthouse keeper is not so different from us. He is a mirror, showing us what might happen if the walls of our ordinary lives were stripped away and we were left with nothing but wind, water, and the echo of our own heartbeat. Memory plays its role, too. When officials bury the truth, when families are left with fragments, when communities pass whispers instead of facts, the story transforms into legend. And legend has its own power. A rational explanation may quiet the mind, but a haunting mystery commands attention for generations. Which do you think lasts longer? The bureaucratic line that reads, "Presumed drowned," or the vision of a wound? Hand reaching from the surf, clawing for something we dare not name? And so, I turn the question to you. If you were in his place alone in that tower, the sea pounding outside, the silence pressing in, what do you believe you would have seen? Would you dismiss the whispers in the fog as tricks of the mind? Or would you, like him, find yourself writing words you could never finish, compelled to record something that no one else would ever understand? This is the paradox of such stories. They terrify us, yet we cannot look away. Perhaps we fear isolation, because it reminds us how thin the boundary is between sanity and madness, between safety and terror, between the world we know and the one we cannot bear to name. The sea still crashes against the rocks. The wind still howls across the cliffs. And that lighthouse, the same one that swallowed a man whole in 1910, still stands, its beam sweeping across the dark, as if nothing ever happened. Ships pass. Sailors sleep easier knowing its light is there. And yet, no logbook, no inspection, no official report has ever erased the unease. Something was lost in that tower. Perhaps it was only a man. Or perhaps it was something larger, a truth too, heavy for history to carry. And so the questions remain. Did he fall victim to solitude, to madness pressing in from within? Or did he confront something older than stone and sea, something that left no trace but silence? Few have heard this story, and fewer still have dared to confront what it might mean. Tonight you have. I want to hear from you. If you were left alone in that tower, night after night, with only the endless ocean as your witness, what do you believe you would have seen? Would you explain it away as exhaustion, or admit that some things in this world defy reason? Share your thoughts in the comments. The discussion that follows may be as haunting as the story itself. Thank you for venturing into the dark with me. If this story unsettled you, if it made you think differently about silence, solitude, or the sea, consider subscribing and joining this community of curious souls who aren't afraid to face what history prefers to forget. And if you thought this tale was unsettling, wait until you hear about the shipwreck, This should never have existed. A vessel recorded in no ledger, claimed by no nation, and yet found adrift with its crew missing as if plucked from time itself. That story is coming soon. Until then, remember, some lights were built to guide us, but others, perhaps, to warn us. And the keeper's light, though long extinguished, still burns in the questions it leaves behind.